So, even from the shackles of death, my old enemy pursues me. You're too late, Fortescue. Already my army has risen from the grave. You will never leave this necropolis.
You can always tell that Halloween is just around the corner because all the publishers start to drop their themed titles to latch in on the season, and this time around in this video we are going to take a look at Sony's one, which is MediEvil. Now, MediEvil has been around for a long time. The original game was released on the PlayStation 1, and fans have been clamoring for Sony to do something about this for quite a while because it was a beloved franchise back in the day. But it has been on ice for quite a while, so we've been waiting and waiting and waiting for Sony to do something, and this is that game, and it is a remake of that PlayStation 1 original. So you have to assume that Sony is testing the water to see if there's still some kind of commercial viability in this property before it goes all out and creates an all-new game, and this is a way of testing to see if the audience is still there. And yeah, it's well, let's have a talk about it. MediEvil back on the PlayStation 1 was one of those kind of old style platformers from the time that Mario 64 was kind of ruling the roost, and that means certain things. Levels were relatively short, action is relatively simple, it doesn't have that kind of flowing combat system with lock-ons and all that kind of thing that we have come to expect from, I guess, our action games in the years since. And it really is about making your way through a level, figuring out a couple of light puzzles. Usually there's a couple of secrets to unlock if you really scour the environment and all that kind of stuff. But it's not the most complex game, let's put it that way. It's not the most complex system to deal with, and the levels are relatively short and to the point. And none of that has actually changed for this remake. So while the remake has updated the graphics, and it actually looks quite pretty, none of the basic gameplay has not been really edited in any way. It is the same kind of levels, the action is very similar, and the developers have not taken much initiative when it comes to updating how MediEvil plays. And to be honest, I think that's not a good thing for the game. I think that MediEvil was a product of its time, and if you go back and play that original today, it doesn't hold up particularly well. You can see why people had fun with it back in the day, but it doesn't. You'd struggle to understand how it's kind of a phenomenon today because we've just moved on. Games play differently now. We have different expectations about action. Boss battles, we have different expectations about boss battles, and the kind of really simplistic boss battles that this game has are not really in vogue anymore. And this is really a product of its past. So when you look at games that try to emulate that old style of platformer like Ukulele or whatever, the developers do try and do things to modernize the way it plays, and this has not been the case with this game, to its detriment. On the plus side, and it is a very positive plus, the game still has its great sense of humour, and the graphical update really does help with its Tim Burton, Danny Elfman style vibe. It's that really kind of comedic horror, but not really horror, ghouls and ghosts and all that kind of stuff, but done fun, that people have become really quite attached to, and it's become something of an institution thanks to Mr. Burton himself in the cinema world. And this game really does capture that vibe. That was always part of the game, the original game. The reason you play it was because your main character, Sir Daniel here, is a bit of a goof, and his story famously starts with him being shot through the eye in the first, and becomes the first victim of the war with the evil sorcerer. He comes back to life to, I guess, get a second chance, and he's a bit of a hopeless dolt. And yeah, it's that kind of slapstick, very light-hearted, very appropriate for young children as well, kind of Halloween style game. What you're seeing here is one of the first two bosses in action. I've got footage of the other boss, the first boss, a little bit later on. I haven't recorded too far into this game because people who haven't experienced MediEvil before, and that's probably a lot of people because this game is quite old, will want to experience a lot of this stuff for themselves. I really just wanted to give you an idea of what it's about. In terms of complexity, the game doesn't get too much more complex than this later on. Boss battles are quite simple, like they don't have very complex patterns. Once you've worked out what the basic pattern is. It's just a matter of kind of spamming through the same process to slowly whittle down that boss's health. That's not to say it's necessarily easy, because if the bosses do hit you, they do take a good chunk of life off you. But I wouldn't say that MediEvil is a particularly difficult game, which is a little bit unusual for platformers of that era. They tended to be a little bit more unforgiving than they are these days, at least in terms of the ability to lose and die and get game over screens. That doesn't happen too often in modern platformers, but it definitely was a thing back in the day that this game was around. But yeah, it's as you can see, the boss battle is fairly repetitive. Thankfully, it controls fine. There's no issues with the controls, although I did find it a little bit difficult to kind of get my head around the way that Sir Dan here moves, that he's not quite as flexible with his dodging and his defensive abilities as I'm used to from platformer characters these days. I think we've all been a bit spoilt from the likes of Bayonetta and Devil May Cry. We see this kind of game with linear kind of platformer style levels, and we expect that kind of fluidity in combat system, which obviously you don't get with this one. But again, it works. It does do its job. There are plenty of pickups and bonuses to find as you play along, as you can see right here just then on the screen. Even early on in the game, I've got half dozen different weapons to choose between, and certain bosses pretty much require certain weapons to get past, which is good. The variety of the weapons is good. There's range, there's heavy, there's light weapons, and there's your trusty sword and shield for the everyday kind of enemies. So all of that's good. Nothing about this game is really offensive. It's just a product of a time. It's quite old. And I guess the problem that Sony has is that they've released this right at the worst possible time for them to check on the viability of this property. Not only does Sony have its own rather spectacularly hyped game coming in Death Stranding not that far away at all, but there's also Nintendo. Nintendo has a very similarly themed game coming in, Luigi's Mansion 3, which is also one of those kind of light-hearted, comedic, kind of Tim Burton-style ghost stories. And that one rips on the House on Haunted Hill and all that kind of stuff. So Sony's really put it up to this character to see if he has any kind of viability and still has an audience. And I kind of hope he does. I've got these ideas in my head that MediEvil, using the kind of God of War engine and style of gameplay, but keeping that sense of humor and the visual style, would be something really spectacular. And I really hope that Sony realizes that, whether this game performs particularly well or not, there are a whole lot of extra, circumstances that might be affecting the sales of this one when it lands. And it would be disappointing if this is the end of MediEvil, because I do think that there's potential to modernize this franchise and make it something that people love all over again. But as I've said a fair bit in the recent past, remakes are a tricky proposition, because on the one hand you want to stay true to the original, but on the other you do need to modernize it for a modern audience. And I feel like where something like Link's Awakening remastered on the Switch really did work, this one is a little bit too true to the original in terms of how it plays. They haven't done enough for a game that's aged. Link's Awakening is still very playable by today's standards, whereas this one, the games industry's moved on. They've found new tricks for how to develop platformers and action games and stuff. And you don't see this kind of game made anymore, for good reason. When they originally made MediEvil, developers were still learning how to work with 3D worlds. They were still learning how to be expansive, and game memory and all that kind of stuff was limited, so level design was smaller by necessity. None of that stuff is really relevant in the modern era. So I enjoyed this game. I don't have huge hopes for it turning heads, unfortunately, but if you have fond memories of MediEvil, you'll get a bit of a nostalgic rush in playing this one. So that's it for this video. This is a short one. I don't have too much else to say. I do have a review coming as well, so you can read extended thoughts in some areas on that once it's live. Otherwise, please do back me on Patreon if you enjoy my videos. As always, it really does help me to do more of them. Otherwise, we'll be back with the next one, and probably not too long. I've got one coming for Death Stranding, if nothing else. So thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you at the next video.